The number on the paper did not make sense. Dr. Pruitt read it once, then read it again, and then he set the sheet down on the tailgate of his truck and just stood there in the cold morning light, staring at a field full of chickens. Behind him, 40 head of cattle grazed quietly across a green pasture that 1 year earlier had been killing them. The fecal egg count in his hand should have been in the thousands. That was what he expected. That was what every test on this farm had shown for 3 years running. Instead, the number was so low he thought the lab had made a mistake and tested the wrong animal. He looked up at the woman standing beside him, a woman the whole county had spent a year laughing at, and he said the only honest thing he could think of, "I have never seen this before. Not once." "What on earth did you do?" Ruth Calloway did not answer right away. She just watched a hen scratching through the pasture behind the herd. The same hens her neighbors called a foolish old woman's pets. And she felt something loosen in her chest that had been clenched tight for a very long time. To understand why that little slip of paper meant so much, you have to go back. You have to understand what Ruth had already lost, and how close she had come to losing the rest. Ruth Calloway was 62 years old, and she had buried her husband Tom on a gray afternoon in November, 3 years before that test result changed everything. Tom had run their cattle farm in the hills of southern Missouri for nearly 40 years, the same way his father had run it, and his father before him. Ruth had spent those years beside him. She kept the books. She pulled calves at 2 in the morning in the freezing rain. She knew that farm the way she knew her own hands. But Tom had always handled the herd, and the herd had always been the thing that kept the lights on. When Tom passed, the farm passed to Ruth, and so did the problem that had been quietly growing in that pasture for years. The problem that Tom, God rest him, had never quite been able to beat. The cattle were sick, and nobody could figure out how to stop it. It started small, a calf that would not put on weight, no matter how much it ate. A cow that grew thin and rough-coated through the summer, her ribs showing even on good grass. Then another, then a whole group of yearlings that just seemed to fade, standing at the edge of the field, with their heads low, breathing too fast, their eyelids gone pale as paper. Ruth would run her thumb under a cow's eye and see that whitish pink where there should have been deep red, and her stomach would drop, because by then she knew exactly what it meant. Worms, stomach worms, the parasites that live in the gut of cattle, that suck blood and steal nutrition, and, in a bad enough load, will kill an animal slow and quiet, right out in the open, where you can watch it happen, and not be able to stop it. Now, every cattle farmer deals with worms. That is not the story. Worms are as old as cattle. The story is what happens when the medicine stops working. For decades, farmers had a simple answer. You bought a dewormer, a chemical called an anthelmintic, and you ran it through the herd twice a year, and the worms died, and the cattle got better. Tom had done it that way his whole life. Ruth kept doing it after he was gone. She bought the pour-on dewormer, the kind you squirt along the animal's spine, and she treated every head in the herd, and she waited for them to bounce back. They did not bounce back. She treated them again, sooner than she should have. Still nothing. The thin ones got thinner. She lost a heifer that spring, a good young animal that should have been the future of the herd. And when she called out the vet, Dr. Pruitt ran a test on the manure, the fecal egg count, and the number came back enormous. Thousands of parasite eggs per gram. The dewormer she had paid good money for, the dewormer she had trusted, had barely touched them. The worms on Ruth Calloway's farm had stopped dying. Dr. Pruitt sat with her at the kitchen table that day and told her the truth, and it was a hard truth. He explained the parasites, when you hit them with the same chemical year after year after year, learn to survive it. The few that happen to be resistant live through the treatment. They breed, their offspring are resistant too. Do that for 30 or 40 years on the same ground, and one day you look up, and almost every worm in your pasture shrugs off the medicine like it was water. He called it dewormer resistance, and he told her it was happening on farms all over the country, and that there was no new miracle chemical coming to save anybody. The last of the good ones were already failing. Ruth asked him what she was supposed to do, and Dr. Pruitt, who was an honest man, told her he did not entirely know. That is where most people would have quit. Ruth thought about it. She was 62. She was tired. The farm was worth a fair bit of money if she sold the cattle and leased the ground to somebody younger. Her daughter in Kansas City had a spare room and had been asking her to come stay for years. There was a version of the story where Ruth Calloway sold out that autumn, and nobody would have blamed her one bit. But there was a stubborn thing in Ruth, the same thing that had gotten her through 40 winters on that hill, and it would not let her walk away from Tom's herd because a worm had beaten her. So instead of quitting, she started reading. If you have ever cared for a piece of land or an animal or anybody who depended on you, I think you understand what happened next. So before we go on, if this story is speaking to something in you, do me a favor and let me know down below where you are watching from and whether you have ever kept livestock yourself. It helps more than you know, and I read every one. Now, back to Ruth. She read everything she could find. Old farming books from Tom's shelf, new pamphlets from the extension office. She drove 2 hours to a grazing conference in a church basement and sat in the back and took notes on the back of a feed receipt. And slowly, out of all that reading, one strange old idea kept surfacing. An idea that made the men at the feed store laugh out loud when she finally said it aloud. The idea was chickens, not to eat the worms directly. That is where people always misunderstood her, and that is where the mocking started. The idea was about the manure. Here is the thing Ruth learned, the thing that turned out to matter more than any bottle of chemical. Those stomach worms have a life cycle, and most of that life cycle does not happen inside the cow at all. It happens out in the pasture, in the manure. A worm living in a cow's gut lays eggs. Those eggs pass out of the animal in the manure and land on the ground in a fresh cow pat. Inside that moist, warm pat, the eggs hatch into tiny larvae. The larvae grow, and then, when the conditions are right, they crawl up out of the manure and up the blades of wet grass, and they wait. The cow comes along, grazes that grass, and swallows the larvae, and the whole cycle starts over, bigger every time. So the pasture itself was the factory, the manure pats were the nurseries, and every time Ruth moved her cattle onto fresh grass, they were walking right back into a field seeded with the children of the very worms she was trying to kill. The chemical only ever fought the war inside the cow. It never touched the factory outside. But something else could. Ruth had read about farms, a few of them scattered around the country, that ran laying hens behind their cattle. Not with them, behind them, the cattle would graze a patch of pasture for a day or two, and then get moved on to the next patch. And a few days later, after the cattle were gone, the chickens would come through that same ground, and chickens, it turns out, do one thing better than almost any animal alive. They scratch. They tear apart every cowpat looking for something to eat, and what they find in there, what they gobble up by the beakful, are the fly larvae and the worm larvae growing in the manure. The chickens ate the parasites before the parasites could climb the grass. They broke the factory. It was so simple that Ruth almost did not believe it could work. And it was so simple that when she explained it to her neighbor Earl Hutchins across the fence line one afternoon, Earl laughed so hard he had to lean on his gatepost. Chickens, Earl said, wiping his eyes. You are going to cure your cattle with chickens. Ruth, honey, when Tom passed I told everybody you would hold up fine. Do not go proving me wrong. Word got around the way it does in a small county. Ruth Calloway had gone soft. Ruth Calloway was going to save her farm with a flock of hens. Down at the feed store they had a name for the little coop she started building on an old hay wagon. They called it the Chicken Circus. Men who had known her 30 years shook their heads and said it was a shame, a proud woman like that, losing her herd and losing her sense at the same time. Ruth heard all of it. She was not deaf, and she was not a fool, but she had run out of other answers, and a foolish plan she believed in was worth more to her than a sensible plan that had already failed. So she built her coop on that old wagon, a rolling hen house she could tow from paddock to paddock behind her four-wheeler, and she bought 200 laying hens, and she started, and I will tell you plainly, the first months were not a triumph. They were a mess. The very first week, before she had the electric netting figured out, something got into the flock at night. She came out at dawn to feathers scattered across the dew, and 11 hens dead, and the tracks in the mud told her it was a fox. Maybe 2. Earl heard about that too. She could feel him not saying anything, which was almost worse than the laughing. Ruth did not quit. She strung a hot wire, a low line of electric fence around the coop each night, and she learned to close the birds in after dark, and the killing stopped. But that was only the first problem. The hens did not understand her plan. She would move the cattle off a paddock and tow the coop into place, expecting the birds to march straight to the manure and get to work like little employees. Instead, they scattered into the tall grass to chase grasshoppers and dust themselves in the shade and generally ignore the cowpats entirely. For weeks it looked like Earl was right. It looked like she had 200 pets and a dying herd, and a county full of people waiting to say I told you so. Then the weather nearly finished her. That first summer turned dry, a real drought. the kind that cracks the ground and turns the pasture to straw. The cow pats baked hard as pottery in the sun, and a chicken cannot scratch apart a manure pat that has turned to a brick. The larvae did not care about the drought. Some of them just went dormant, waiting deep in the dry ground for the rain to come back. And Ruth stood in her brown field and understood that her whole idea depended on things she did not control, on moisture, on timing, on the ground being soft enough, and the manure being fresh enough for the birds to do their work. She had traded a chemical she understood for a living system she was only beginning to. She almost sold out that August. She had the number of a cattle buyer written on the pad by the phone. She looked at it every morning. What stopped her was one small thing she noticed on an evening walk, near the end of that dry summer, in a low corner of the farm, where a spring kept the ground damp even in the drought. In that one green corner, the cattle had grazed a few weeks back, and the hens had worked it hard, because the moist ground let them tear the pats apart. And Ruth, walking through, realized she had not seen a single fly rise up off the manure. On the rest of the dry farm, the flies were a torment, clouds of them boiling off every cow pat. But right there, where the chickens had done their job, the manure was scattered flat and picked clean, and the flies were simply gone. It was not proof. It was not a test result. It was just flies, or the lack of them. But Ruth Calloway had spent her whole life reading small signs in a field, and that one told her the thing was real. The chickens were working, she just had not given them the whole farm yet. And she had not given the system time to break a life cycle that had taken decades to build. She tore up the buyer's number. When the rains finally came that fall, the ground softened, and Ruth got serious. She had learned, by then, exactly how to make the birds do what she needed. The secret was timing. She could not put the chickens on the pasture the same day as the cattle, because the manure was too fresh, and she could not wait too long, because then the larvae had already climbed the grass and escaped. There was a window, a matter of a few days after the cattle moved off, when the pats were still soft and full of maturing larvae, and that was when the hens had to come through. 3 days, 4 at the most. Move the cattle, wait, then bring in the coop and let 200 hens tear that ground apart before the parasites could rise. She built her whole rotation around it. Cattle onto fresh grass, cattle off in a day or two, coop in behind them on the 3rd day, hens working the pats down to nothing, then move it all forward, around and around the farm, the herd in front, and the flock behind, all season long. She started calling it the parade when she talked to herself, which, out there alone, she did more than she would admit. And here is where the ground itself started to reward her, not with a miracle, but with plain biology. The chickens were not only eating parasites, they were spreading the manure, breaking those pats apart, and scratching them into the soil, which meant the pasture was fertilized evenly instead of in scattered piles the cattle would not graze near. The nitrogen went into the grass instead of into the air. By the following spring, Ruth's pastures were coming in thicker and greener than they had in years. And thicker grass meant healthier cattle, and healthier cattle carry a parasite load better than thin, stressed one. Everything fed everything. The birds fed the soil fed the grass fed the cattle, and the cattle fed the birds. And around it went, and every turn of that wheel was quietly starving the worms out of the ground. She could see it in the cattle before she ever had a number to prove it. The rough coats smoothed out, the thin yearlings started to fill. When she ran her thumb under a cow's eye now, the color was coming back, that deep, healthy red where there had been pale pink. The herd was rising, and she still had not spent $1 on dewormer in over a year. But Ruth was too careful, and had been burned too badly, to trust her own hope. She had believed the chemical worked once. Signs and feelings were not enough. She needed the thing that could not lie. She needed the test. So in the spring of that 2nd year, she called Dr. Pruitt and asked him to come run a full fecal egg count on the herd, the same test that had come back in the thousands and nearly ended her. She did not tell him what she expected. She was not sure herself. She just told him to come collect his samples and run the numbers straight, no favors. He came out on a bright cold morning. He walked the pasture with his kit, collecting fresh samples from a dozen head across the herd, and the whole time his eyes kept drifting over to the coop and the 200 hens working the field behind the cattle, and Ruth could see him deciding, kindly, not to say anything about the chicken circus to the widow's face. He took his samples, and he drove them to the lab himself, and he told her he would call when he had the number. He did not call. He drove back out the next morning with the paper in his hand, because he had to see the farm again with his own eyes to believe what the lab had told him. That is the moment we started with. The tailgate, the code light, Dr. Pruitt reading the number a second time, and a third, and then setting it down and staring at those chickens like they had done something against the laws of nature. The count had dropped by more than 90%. The pasture that had been a parasite factory, the ground that had shrugged off every chemical she threw at it, had gone quiet. There were still some worms. There always would be. A farm is not a clean room, and it never should be. But the load had fallen so far that the cattle could carry it easily, the way healthy cattle on good ground are meant to, and the killing was over. Ruth Calloway had beaten the thing that beat the chemical, and she had done it without any chemical at all. Dr. Pruitt asked her again how, and this time, she told him the whole thing. The life cycle and the timing and the 3-day window and the flies she had noticed in the damp corner in the drought. And that vet, who had gone to school for years and seen thousands of these tests, listened to a 62-year-old widow explain parasite control to him. And at the end he took his hat off, which is a thing men of a certain age do when they mean it, and he told her she ought to be teaching it. Now, I want to be honest with you about what this was and what it was not, because Ruth would want me to be. This was not magic, and it was not luck. It was not even really about chickens. Not exactly. It was about understanding that the worm did not live only in the cow. It lived in the whole system, in the manure and the soil and the grass and the weather, and you could not beat it by attacking one small part of it with one small bottle. You had to change the system itself. Ruth won because she stopped fighting the parasite where it was strongest, inside the animal, and started fighting it where it was weakest, out in the open manure, where a $2 hen could tear its whole nursery apart. The chickens were just the tool. The understanding was the thing, and the understanding cost her a year of being laughed at, a summer of near ruin, a flock half-eaten by foxes, a drought that nearly broke her, and more lonely evenings staring at a cattle buyer's phone number than she ever told anyone about. That is the part the county did not see when they finally started coming around to look at her pastures. They saw the green grass and the healthy herd, and the clever old woman with the rolling coupe. They did not see the cost. There is always a cost, and anybody who tells you a good idea is easy has never actually planted one. Earl Hutchins was the one who surprised her. He came across the fence line one evening the following summer, and he stood there a while, not saying much, watching the hens work behind Ruth's cattle in the low gold light. And then Earl, who had laughed harder than anybody, took his cap off and said, real quiet, that his own herd was carrying worms his dewormer would not touch, and he did not rightly know what to do about it, and he wondered if maybe she would show him how she got started. Ruth did not gloat. She had lost too much to gloat. She just told him to come by in the morning, and she would walk him through it. That was the real ending. If you want to know, not the test result. The test was just paper. The real ending was Earl Hutchinson, hat in hand, asking the woman he had mocked to teach him how to save his cattle, and her saying yes. By the 3rd year there were coops rolling behind cattle on 4 farms in that valley, and then a dozen, and the extension office that Ruth had once driven 2 hours to visit was asking her to come speak. She never got comfortable at the front of a room, but she went, and she stood up in her plain clothes, and she told the young farmers and the old ones the same thing every time. The parasite is not your enemy. She would say, the parasite is just doing what it has always done. Your enemy is thinking that one bottle can beat a whole living system. Learn how the thing actually lives. Find out where it is weak, and then use the land and the animals and the seasons themselves to break it there. The answer was never in the barn cabinet. It was out in the pasture the whole time, in the manure you have been walking past your entire life. Ruth Calloway kept that farm. It is still there, on that hill in southern Missouri, the herd healthy in the coop still rolling along behind them, around and around. The parade she once only muttered about to herself. She is older now, and slower, but she still walks the pasture most evenings, and she still runs her thumb under a cow's eye out of habit. And every single time she sees that deep, healthy red, she thinks about how close she came to selling out, and how the whole thing turned on 200 birds that everybody told her were a joke. There is a lesson in it that goes past cattle and worms, and I think you already feel it. Sometimes, the answer to the problem that is beating you is not a stronger version of the thing that is already failing. It is not a bigger bottle, or a harsher chemical, or one more round of the same tired fight. Sometimes, the The answer is to step back and look at the whole system, the parts you have been ignoring, the humble little pieces everybody walks past, and to understand that the ground has been offering you a solution all along. You just had to be humble enough and stubborn enough and quiet enough to see it. Ruth was mocked for her chickens, and then the vet saw the test, and the number on that paper told a truth the whole county had to learn to believe. If this story stayed with you, there is another one you should hear next. It is about a farmer everyone said was ruining his fields by refusing to plow them, letting them go wild while his neighbors shook their heads, until a soil scientist dug a single core sample out of his ground and found something underneath that changed how that whole county farmed. It is the same kind of story, the same kind of stubborn wisdom, and it is playing right now on the screen. Go ahead and watch it, and I will see you there.